Perfect. So I was saying that the first thesis have to do with reality as the naturalization of war, but also as metaphysical catastrophe, concept that I'm going to explain a little bit more later on. And along with practices of that make expropriation, elimination, early death, and experiences that are worse than death normal. And you find an elaboration of these terms in the thesis. And experiences that are worse than death normal. I was going to say something else about this first part, precisely at the moment when we lost the video. So, but maybe we'll come, and I haven't written that part, so maybe we'll come back later. So that's the first set of five. The second set of five theses offer an account of not modernity coloniality, but decoloniality as a counter turn or a decolonial turn that opposes permanent war, death, naturalization of death and early death, and experiences that are worse than death, with multiple forms of knowledge, action, and creation rooted in love and rage. So love and rage, what we call in there love and rage as sort of anchor of a number of activities at the level of knowledge, action, and artistic creation that militate against modernity coloniality as permanent war and as metaphysical catastrophe. Right? So these are the two sets of five theses, what they are about, more or less. So while modernity coloniality is mounted on forms of deception and pathologies of freedom, that's a concept that appears in Black Skin, White Mass, Fanon's Black Skin, White Mass, that reflects, and he takes from the tradition, existential tradition, that reflects the decadent and the genocidal modern colonial attitude. The decolonial turn is mounted on a decolonial attitude that seeks restoration of the major coordinates of humanity, which I thematize in relation to knowledge, power, and being, as a sort of broad categories, right? Within which you can accommodate many others, but also usually those other categories usually intersect or connect through knowledge, power, and being. Right? That is, attitude is at the basis of the coloniality and the coloniality of power, knowledge, and being. Attitude, I am defining attitude as the orientation of the subject towards knowledge, power, and being. Now, by subject, I'm going to return to the concept of attitude later on. And in addition to the essay that you find in Quaderna, in the journal, on transdisciplinarity and decoloniality, which elaborates the concept of attitude and decolonial attitude, I've also developed it more recently in an essay that I submitted for the Journal of Psychology, looking at the centrality of the concept of attitude in Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask and his psychiatric work. Because I think it's a concept that lends itself to both a philosophical and a psychological approach, right? And it was there at the, and you find it in the literature, in both philosophical and psychological / psychiatric literature. And Fanon was both philosopher and psychiatrist, and I think that's why the concept is so key to what he's trying to do. Now, by subject, I'm going to return to the concept of attitude later on. Can you see me now? Can you see me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay. I can see you, but that's okay. I'll imagine the group there. If it works with you better that way, no problem. Just know that if I look strange, it's because I'm not seeing any image in front of me. Um, but no problem, really. I can do it. Okay?
Sorry, yes, yes. Sorry.
Do you hear me?
It's because there was a problem with the connection in the other side, so they asked me to turn it for you. If it's okay for you, I'll turn it on for the discussion.
No, that's fine. That's fine. But you can listen to me well, right?
Yes.
Okay. Just shout if that changes.
Okay.
Um, okay, so by subject, because I'm talking about the attitude as the orientation of the subject towards knowledge, power, and being. And so by subject, what I understanding is an embodied being whose consciousness emerges in a dynamic interplay between itself and an other or others. So I am understanding subjectivity not so much, not really as a monad or an essence, as a interrelationality or a form of dynamic interrelationality that emerges by virtue of an encounter with otherness. And of course, part of this is in conversation with Emmanuel Levinas, uh, who actually I came recently to know that Fanon read. So he knew. I've done like a Levinasian reading of Fanon to some extent, and without being sure, even knowing that, or even needing that, Fanon read Levinas, but actually he knew about his work. Uh, so in subjectivity, I'm seeing it as dynamic interrelationality that emerges by virtue of an encounter with otherness. This subjectivity is embodied. The body, I am seeing it as that by virtue of which one encounters others, and that by virtue of which others can locate one in a space. The body is the gift that gives. That is, I experience the body as gift, and by virtue of which, and also I experience it as that by virtue of which I can seek to give to others as well as receive. Without bodies, there is no giving and receiving, no interrelationality, no encounter with others, therefore no human subjectivity at all, no consciousness. Coloniality distorts the meaning and basic character of the body as it creates a world where some experience the body as not only an indication of salvation, but also as an extension of divine sovereignty. Right? Some experience the body like that, as divine sovereignty, or as a form of divine sovereignty, and others experience the body as a curse or a form of damnation. So the body then, instead of being the gift that gives, it becomes either a sign of superiority as divine sovereignty or a sign of damnation, a curse or damnation. This is why Fanon invokes what Louis Gordon refers to as the mythopoetics of hell, 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 when describing and critically analyzing anti-blackness. A description of the lived experience of the black subject shows us or demonstrates the extent to which the body has become a sign of damnation for some, placing them in a hell from where there seemed to be no escape. And also how other bodies become a form of salvation or quasi divine presence for others. The body is key because it is that by virtue of which we appear in the world. It is also that through which we enact contact with others and others with ourselves. If the body is experienced as a gift and made to give, but one rather experiences the body as a curse or as a form of damnation, then a veritable reversal has been achieved. The body is no longer the material and practical point for interrelation, for giving and receiving, but rather becomes a target for annihilation. And of course, part of the drama of Black Skin, White Mask is that which involves the self-annihilation, the way in which Black subjects are oriented. The attitude of Black subjects is one of self-annihilation. Right? The masking is about eliminating the Black in you. Right? I'll talk more about this later, but that's how profound it goes, this sort of colonization of the attitude of the human being towards the body, even your own body, not only the body of others. The targeting system of the permanent war of modernity coloniality is effective. The body is not only the target of others out there, but also of myself, is my own target for annihilation in a way. And that is beyond, the subject-object split, the dilemmas and problems of the subject-object split. This is not an issue of subject and object being, the body and the subject being completely separate. This is of having subjectivity as a form of annihilation of dimensions of the body or of the body. So it's not only about this, the subject-object split, it's the subject-body split, but about the coloniality of embodiment. So in this process, the primacy of giving is replaced by the practice of annihilation, even self-annihilation. We are no longer talking about dehumanization as only exploitation from certain modes of production. We are here talking about dehumanization as the basic modification of one's body and one's basic orientations or attitudes in different orders and modes of being. So building on a close reading of Black Skin, White Mask, I have kept developing the connection between donation, from donner, to gift, of course, developing the connection between donation, the human body and subjectivity as gifts that give, and damnation, that course that the body becomes. It was that close reading that led me to look for the etymology of the word damné, the nation, and finding that it is linked to donner, donation, or gift giving. The damnés are, literally speaking, the ones who cannot give because what they have has been taken away from them. Based on this definition, it is possible to see a line of continuity between damnation, a form of damnation that leads subjects to experience their bodies. Based on this, it is possible to see a line of continuity between Fanon's King White Masks, from where I built to make this connection between donation and damnation, and Le Damné de la Terre, where the concept of damnation and therefore, by implication, donation become primary, right? Even come to define the title of the book. In that process, of course, I'm thinking that he's redefining other uses of the Le Damné de la Terre. But I want to sort of now to use that connection between damnation and donation that appears in Black Skin, White Mask to suggest maybe a new way or to see the relationship between that text and Breacher of the Earth and the Damné de la Terre. Because while in Black Skin, White Masks, there is a form of masking, right? The masking part, the masking is described as a basic form of damnation that leads subjects to experience their bodies as a curse. In the other one, damnation is referred to, in a way, the fate of colonized peoples and to the geopolitical, at a geopolitical level. So one is focusing on the position of the subject when that nation hits home and you yourself become the agent of your own annihilation. And the other one is about the position of the emerging spaces, um, the emerging sort of the emerging processes of decolonization in different parts of the world and the of third world peoples across the globe as they navigate the path of being in the Cold War. Right? So connecting the two books makes clear that the nation takes the level of subjectivity as well as at the level of geopolitics or at the geopolitical level, and that these two are interconnected, the subjective and the geopolitical. Also connecting the two books um, call not only for the study of race as coming from Black Skin White Mask, or the study of colonialism as coming from the Les Damnés de la Terre, but for the description, a critical analysis, and an interruption of the logics of that nation, wherever they appear. What I am suggesting is that that nation is different from race in the sense that it is not only concerned with color or anything that we typically refer to as race. Race is a modality, perhaps the most explicit of the nation, but that the nation refers to all the modalities in which interrelationality and giving are interrupted and replaced by the logics of taking and the experience of the body, of one's body as a curse. To call attention to the Damnés de la Terre is not only to call for race analysis or for geopolitical analysis as a kind of competition between, let's say, cultural studies with relation to race and material, historical materialism, or international, analysis of geopolitics writ large and political economy. Um, it's not only to call for those, or even for the linkage between both, but also for all modes of turning, shifting, gift-giving, and dynamic interrelationality into forms of taking, annihilating, and producing permanent war. Calling attention to the nation also invites a turn to turn our attention to gift giving and opposition to permanent war wherever it appears. In this sense, as I see coloniality, it is not only about race and capitalism, as in a way Aníbal Quijano defines them, but about and I'm sort of intentionally using this word to provoke certain kind of, or make possible certain kinds of interventions connecting with Fanon's medical background. That is in the coloniality, not only having to do with race and capitalism, but as the infestation of our world, with a common sense that turns gift giving and make it into annihilation. The modern colonial turn from gift giving to annihilation involves every single dimension of human subjectivity and reality. What usually goes as race, but also what goes sometimes as gender, sexuality, class, temporality, spatiality, knowledge production, and so on. This means that engaging the nation the problem necessitates a transdisciplinary approach and trans-thematic in a way. That is not only about race, class, gender, and so on and so forth, but also about, and not only about the intersections, I think, it's also about a vocabulary that overcomes the idea of these areas being divided ultimately. So this means that engaging that nation as a problem necessitates transdisciplinary approach. I read that. And more specifically, the colonial form of transdisciplinarity. So this is the path from, beginning with the sort of basic explanation of the 10 theses, as 5 theses being on modernity, coloniality, and the other 5 on the coloniality, to the introduction of the concept of transdisciplinarity, and particularly of decolonial transdisciplinarity, which is the focus of the other essay that I mentioned, that you find in Cuaderna in Spanish. And in that essay, what I do is I not only try to define what decolonial transdisciplinarity is in relation to the concept of the decolonial attitude, but also to give an example of it, which I find in what is called US ethnic studies. Right? And so I present a view of US ethnic studies as a form of decolonial transdisciplinarity. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but not too much. That will be yet another topic. So modernity coloniality establishes itself through the solidification of fixed attitudes that lead subjects to relate to their bodies and to perceive their existence in space and time in ways that make them instruments of annihilation and permanent war. These attitudes become part of the formation of subjects as modern, meaning that becoming modern is to be socialized into a world of permanent war, and also a socialization that includes one becoming a functional instrument of it, right? A weapon of war. Subjectivity in a way as a weapon of war in that permanent war. Attitudes are formed sociogenically, and they come to characterize not only the basic posture of individuals, but also that of collectives, including institutions. Institutional arrangements are mounted on and reproduce certain form of attitudes. Modernity coloniality is a historical project that creates institutions that reflect and produce a modern colonial attitude. And again, it's an attitude that shifts given for annihilation and permanent war. Institutions that reflect and produce a modern colonial attitude include the modern nation state and the modern Western university and its disciplines. The European sciences house the modern Western research university can differ with each other with regards to methods, but they share a modern colonial attitude. In that sense, what distinguishes what is called U.S. ethnic studies, which I think can also be referred to as third world studies, but also as decolonial thinking, or a peculiar form of decolonial thinking. What distinguishes that from the European sciences is not only a different approach to method, but also and more fundamentally the attitude. And this for me is key here because I've worked in ethnic studies programs for a while, and these were programs that emerged out of student organizing and mobilization inspired by third world revolts, third world revolutions. So at the University of California, Berkeley, where I taught for 7 years, that department came out of the student strike organized by a coalition of organizations of students of color that went as the Third World Liberation Front. And so since ethnic studies and ethnic studies programs were created, they are looked at from the traditional fields, from history, from sociology, from English, and so on and so forth, economy, political science and so on and so forth, is that this is more like an intimate area of knowledge production because it doesn't have its own methodology. Like the absence of method render it uh, not only irrelevant but also uh, render it with a complete lack of rigor. Um, and so there is usually, I mean, this is part, I think, of epistemic racism, right? Just so like the bodies that were involved in the creation of these fields were seen as having no thinking. Of course, what they create as a space also is regarded as ultimately having no substance, no epistemological substance. And so there's typically U.S. ethnic studies are usually seen in a very negative light, even sometimes by people who teach in those programs who have been trained in the European sciences, right, in the traditional disciplines. So what I'm trying to argue here is that there is something more fundamental than method, and it is attitude, and that is where the differentiation between these areas comes. And so the focus on method is extremely limited in this regard. So what the European sciences do is that by focusing on method, they hide the fact that they are being oriented by an attitude that they share, which is that modern colonial attitude, which is that made them modern in the first place, and what connects them to the Western University as an institution of the nation, and also of imperialism. So in that sense, the revolt of students in the late 60s and early 70s is a fundamental epistemological revolt that brings attention to the common attitude that the European sciences share. And by having a particular kind of attitude, then that leads to the glorification of method, but also to the imperial and colonizing use of methods, right? Which is what indigenous peoples across the world have experienced more or less every time that the traditional anthropologists go to them, and so on and so forth. But also you see those methods still defining work, and the fact, stand behind the canons, the very Eurocentric canons of the disciplines and the fields. So in that sense, U.S. ethnic studies, what third world studies slash decolonial thinking, what it introduces is it's another attitude. It's the decolonial attitude, and it's that attitude that makes the suspension of disciplines, of which Lewis Gordon speaks and writes about, necessary. Right? That is the suspension or the skepticism about the glorification of method in ethnic studies is not some signal, is not a signal of some sort of immaturity and lack of rigor, but of the colonial attitude. Right? Of there being something more basic than method that is necessary to reconstruct in order for knowledge to take place. But also you see those methods still defining work, and the fact, stand behind the canons, the very Eurocentric canons. So again, to repeat, then attitude is more basic than method in knowledge production. And it is, and this is key, attitude also is not only linked to knowledge, right? To knowledge formation. And when you, I mean, here attitude, think about, I mean, it's a concept that has been worked in European philosophy. Think of Husserl's notion of the phenomenological attitude, Habermas' notion of the post-conventional attitude, and so on and so forth. So there has been some attention to that in Western philosophy, but I think in the purview of the modern colonial attitudes, right? Still taking that as the sort of the point of departure of the what has not been able to be challenged. And what I find in Black White Mask is a denunciation of the modern colonial attitude and an effort, very rigorous effort, to try to find the conditions of possibility or explore the conditions of possibility of a decolonial attitude. That is an attitude that will lead to another form of knowledge. But it's not only attitude is so basic that is not only about knowledge production, it is also connected with power, and it's also connected with being. That's why I defined attitude earlier as an orientation towards knowledge, being, and power. So what I have been doing in the last few minutes is spell out the relevance of attitude for knowledge and the disciplines and so on, because I was referring to the institutions. I was referring to embedded attitudes in institutions, one of those institutions being the Modern Western Research University. That attitude is embedded in the disciplines of that university. And so what I'm saying is that the revolt of students in the late 60s, early 70s was a revolt against that overwhelming, overarching attitude, which is the same attitude that Fanon finds in Black subjects who aim to become white, who experience their bodies as a curse, and try to adopt masks to appear as whites. Um, so in that sense, that shows, I hope, in the epistemological relevance of black and white mask, and not only the social relevance or psychological relevance of the text, and also of the treatment of attitudes in the text. So let me say a little bit more about attitudes, and particularly about the decolonial attitude, and then conclude with a brief reflection on metaphysical catastrophe. Right. Metaphysical catastrophe, as I said, is the way in which I'm sort of thematizing the idea of modernity coloniality. Decolonial attitude is at the center of the decolonial term and decoloniality. Um, so let me, since I've been talking about attitude, let me continue developing that. It won't be, it's only a few minutes, and then turn into a metaphysical catastrophe, because it's typically it's one of the more obscure concepts. It can mean so many things. So I can share how I'm trying to think about it and relating it to this. So the decolonial attitude. It should be clear by now that I'm not referring to attitude or the decolonial attitude as a sort of a feeling, but rather to learn from Michel Foucault, something more like, and I quote, a relation of belonging and that presents itself as a task. That presents itself as a task. Foucault provides a definition of attitude when he's presenting an account of modernity as he writes, not an epoch, but as an attitude in his classic essay on Kant's wise enlightenment. So I do not take the notion of attitude from Foucault's essay, though, as I have said. Attitude is this central concept in Husserlian phenomenology, in existential philosophy, and in existential philosophy previous to Foucault's use of it in that essay. And I take it more specifically from Fanon's Black and White Mask, in which the concept is approached again through the lenses of philosophy, but also psychology. And it serves for a description and a critical analysis of the attitude of Black colonial subjects as they face the dominant white Western world. It also comments on the attitudes of white subjects in face of this reality of damnation. And the attitude is usually one of escape, not acknowledging the reality, and so on and so forth. Something that you still see today with discourse on color blindness and so on and so forth. So approaching the concept of attitude through Fanon's work leads me to think of decolonization not only as an epoch, but as an attitude. Right? And that will be the parallel argument with Foucault. Fanon's Black and White Mask is a book that is in the search for an attitude. And Sartre has a collection of writings that are published under the title, at least in English, I don't remember in French, but at least in English is Search for a Method. So I'm trying to read in Black and White Mask, Fanon writes that he leaves methods to the botanists and the mathematicians. And so I am posing Black and White Mask as a book that is in the search for an attitude. And specifically for the kind of attitude that can engage in a decolonial turn. That is in a turn away from modernity coloniality and towards what Fanon referred to as building the world of you. And that building the world of you in Fanon I'm seeing it as the kind of world where gift-giving, reciprocity, and similar practices can take place, where therefore the body recovers the role and meaning as a gift, and as a gift that gives, right? Instead of a weapon of war, of annihilation. Now, so I'm seeing the decolonial attitude as that which makes possible the decolonial turn. And the decolonial turn and the decolonial attitude are sort of a response to modernity coloniality, which I am seeing as a form of metaphysical catastrophe. And the notion of catastrophe itself, and now in shifting towards the last section, the etymology of the word catastrophe is a Greek word, and it means a downturn. It means a downturn. For strophe means turning, like catastrophe. Kata um, means down, so it's a downturn, meaning like a fatal turning point in a drama. It means like to come to an end in an abrupt form. Right? And so I'm seeing the decolonial attitude as that which makes possible the decolonial turn. The concept of metaphysical catastrophe, I try to illustrate it with some diagrams that I include in the outline of 10 theses. So I cannot present it here, um, even though Skype has one of those things that you can present. So it's not impossible, but I won't take time presenting that. You can look at it by yourselves. But I see this downturn. I call it metaphysical catastrophe, because it's a downturn of the basic, if you will, metaphysical structure of human reality. And so I'm trying to think that's how I'm seeing being, knowledge, and power. Being, knowledge, and power. I'm seen as part of a metaphysical infrastructure of reality, if you will. Each one, I'm looking at each concept, being, power, and knowledge, in relation with three concepts. It's like a triad of concepts, and each one incorporates a triad of concepts. So I'm looking at um, knowledge in relation to subject or subjectivity, object, and method. I'm looking at power in relation to culture, structure, and subject. And I'm looking at being in relation to space, time, and subjectivity. Common to the three, to being, power, and knowledge, is subject. The three triads has subject. And that's what I'm saying, that the embodied subject is at the crossroads of being, power, and knowledge. So embodied subjectivity is in form of interrelation with other and others that takes place at the crossroads of being, power, and knowledge. In fact, being, power, and knowledge are the very outcome, or their very foundation, their very start to the dynamic, the interrelational dynamic between subject and others, among subjects. Um, so in that sense, that nation, what I've called that nation before, is created by the orchestration, a certain orchestration of power, being, and knowledge. That is the kind of orchestration that leads power to become the coloniality of power, being the coloniality of being, and knowledge the coloniality of knowledge. So, and they all cross in the embodied subjects and their attitudes. So attitude is that which in the subject allow for certain formations of being, power, and knowledge to continue existing or to be challenged. And that's why the decolonial attitude is so critical. And that's why Fanon is in a desperate search for that attitude in Black Skin, White Mask, right? It's desperate. I mean, I don't mince words in that sense, because he talks about moments of weeping, crying, praying, or very performative moments that are part of that search for the right attitude, also as the right form of relating to your body. And he relates that to the the action, the desire to build the world of you. That is to restore the world of intersubjectivity, so that then you can transform also being, power, and knowledge. So metaphysical catastrophe then, because it's this downturn of these basic modalities of our human world, being knowledge and power. And the fatal turning point is that with modernity, coloniality, they now become sort of a part of a global civilization project that changes the dynamics of gift giving to and replace them by dynamics of annihilation and permanent war. And that's why modernity as a civilization project, in a way, cannot but proceed through multiple areas, multiple forms of colonization, from very concrete and so on, linked to global empires, to more subtle and sometimes to not so subtle, but of uh, um, other forms, like subjective at the level not only of geopolitics, but at the level of a region or so-called nation, or between, or even in the psyche of the subject also. Um, so that's why the catastrophe is massive, and it sort of changes the meaning of human reality altogether. Meaning then that decolonization is a counter-catastrophic project. Now, to conclude, catastrophe, in a way, I think it's, for me, it makes sense being in this dialogue with Fanon's work, because Fanon first, I refer to attitude as this sort of turning point in a drama, and Fanon wrote plays, and he also referred to the struggle of human existence in conditions of dehumanization as a drama. The concept of drama appears a number of times in his writings, and so drama makes reference to the irreducible temporal character of human existence. And so the temporal character of human existence points to the time of the subject, the temporality of experience, of human experience, but also the temporal character of collective human existence, that is history. So key to this dimension is both the space that the body occupies, but also the way, the temporal dimension, the way in which temporality is experienced at the level of the subject, and also the way in which history is understood in a given context. And because of that, the role, the centrality of temporality also in the notion of drama, the notion of the catastrophic makes particular sense in this context, I think. Um, and also because there is an element of the tragic in Fanon's analysis of the lived experience of coloniality, at both the level of the subject, but also on historical levels. Now, when one refers to metaphysical catastrophe, then one identifies the moments, historical moment of metaphysical catastrophe. I think that that major turn took place, genealogically speaking, in what we call the long 16th century, a crucial point being 1492, of course, but not understood as, as a particular date, but as part of a process of that long century that begins before the 16th century and continues sometime after the 16th century. So calling attention to metaphysical catastrophe at both at the level of genealogy, looking at the historical moments of continuities and discontinuities, and also at the level of the subject, the catastrophe of the subject that appears, for example, at the start of Black Skin, White Mass, at the chapter 5, when the bodily schema is broken down and the historical racial schema takes its place as a moment of catastrophe at the level of subjectivity. So with metaphysical catastrophe is calling for attention of those moments where of fatal turning points, instead of, for example, looking at seeking to understand our reality through a history of the species, like a history of the species by looking, for example, at the so-called noble savage. So looking at metaphysical catastrophe calls for attention not to, let's say, a history of the species, human species in general, but more particularly to these moments of the turning points, which are sociogenically produced, are part of a social dynamics and part of a history. And so also metaphysical catastrophe leads away from approaches to human reality in terms of like the state of nature theories, like this hypothesis of a beginning for humankind, like thinking that you're going to understand human reality by trying to imagine what the actual beginning could have been like. So in Fanon, instead, the beginning is the moment of rupture, the moment of catastrophe itself, is what gives rise to thought. Um, and that makes this project very different from traditional liberal theory, which is often grounded on the hypothetical project of a state of natures. Things, from Hobbes, Rousseau, and so on. But to conclude, metaphysical catastrophe calls attention to the interruption, the discontinuity that represented, and one that represented the most radical subversion of the basic coordinates of humanity that we have known, as well as the most expansive, meaning modernity, coloniality. Right? That modernity, coloniality, remember that this project of expansion of the West, it is the first time that a civilization now imagines the globe as a globe and seeks to reach out and to bring that globe under its control. And that's part of what makes the modernity coloniality so catastrophic. Right? Is the first civilization project that has a full awareness of the geographical contour of the planet and that aims to incorporate it to reach to every corner. So we're not talking just about any civilization system or any kind of catastrophe. We're talking about a major turning down of events. When that massive project um, takes annihilation and permanent war as a central aspiration. So to conclude, calling then for something, and instead of being calling for something like damnation studies, even though studies is still too traditional to encapsulate it, right? Damnation, thinking about damnation, I don't know. But thinking about damnation, carrying with it the notion that damnation is also the absence of donation. So it's also about studies of the gift and gift giving. That is, this calls for an analysis of modernity coloniality as a major catastrophic moment that involves a historical project, modern civilization, so-called modern civilization, and that is grounded on basic attitudes, modern colonial attitudes, and also decoloniality as the expression of a decolonial turn of love and rage, and decolonial attitudes that lead subjects to experience their bodies and the world differently, and that open these bodies to uninhibited forms of human interaction. So that's then the way in which I connect the metaphysical catastrophe to modern colonial attitudes, to then the decolonial turn, and decolonial attitudes, and the attempt to build the world of you in Fanon's terms. So I'm losing my voice, and I finish anyway. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Nelson. Thank you very much for this very rich and interesting conference, which is, there are a lot of new things and new concepts. We already suggested the 10 theses on colonization that you talked about. In this conference, you propose that modernity and decoloniality and coloniality are characterized by the naturalization of war and the metaphysical catastrophe, which you say it changes the dynamic of gift-giving. It takes away from subjects the capacity or the modalities of capacity to give, and coloniality will be characterized by this form of creating subjectivities that experience their own bodies are as a course, and so that produces conducts of self-aggressiveness. So you propose to the concept of damnation instead of that of coloniality of power, which is proposed by Aníbal Quijano, because it gives a more, it encompasses not only issues of race, but also gender and other kinds of problems that are also in relation with coloniality. And so you say that what is important is that coloniality and modernity produce a certain kind of attitude, and so that decolonial transdisciplinarity should be able to propose a switch or a turn in this attitude, and to yeah, sorry, in my English it's horrible, so I will stop there, and I will give the floor to the people for questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question about action and for Fanon. I think he agrees with the violence of action. And
I'm sorry, I cannot listen well. I don't know if maybe
Yeah.
I have to approach the computer. Maybe I'm sorry.
Yes, no, I think
yes, thank you very much for your presentations. I have a question about the relationship between action and love. For Fanon, I think he agrees with the violence of action when we vote to the violence, to the power, or to the strength of the regime or the tyranny government. And but on the other way, we know that as you mentioned, the colonial term involved the restoration of love between the people, and especially you have talked about it in your presentation about to give and to receive the capacity of subjectivity. So I have a question about the relationship between the action with violence and love. How could we balance well between two of them? This is my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I see love and violence as really two very different things. The opposite of love for me, would be hate. Let's say hate, right? In the ordinary way, right? But violence could be done with hate or with love, or in a different way, right? That is, violence is a state of affair, or maybe an action that usually interrupts the order in some way. And usually interrupting an order is enough for it to be rendered violent. So first off, violence is not opposite to love. Hate might be, and violence can be loving or hateful, come from love or not. And second, violence is not, at the more fundamental level, is not about this thing that we imagine, like armed revolutionary war or criminal violence or things like that. Violence typically means the disruption of an order, and usually is qualified as violence by the order itself. So in that sense, we already, the third point would be that we live in a world of institutionalized violence, where the break of the order is this basic order of human existence, where we can take our bodies as points of contact with other bodies and so on. So we already live in a violent world, in a world that is violent and is changing, is dramatically changing our reality. and making us into weapons of war, of annihilation, because we annihilate ourselves, so we annihilate other people. So we already live in a context of systematic violence in that sense, right? That shows itself from everything, from a violence that is present in Eurocentric um, canons of disciplines, just as it is present in police brutality on the streets, for example, or the approach to black subjects, black bodies. To think about Black Lives Matters and so on. So that is third. We already live in a modernity coloniality is a violent order. And so the question is, how do you as a subject respond to this violent order? And the answer here through Fanon is, well, is in a loving way, but love for what and how? That is another question. So you want to restore the possibility of gift giving, restoration, and so on. That's where love comes in. But you are going to do it by any means necessary. Um, you are going to study maybe with the more basic and maybe with the less disruptive if you want, but you're not going to be satisfied with the continuity of the system. So if the system seems completely intractable to change, then there is a moment when something like what Fanon faced, military struggle, becomes necessary out of your desire to bring about the world of you. Now, this is violence not seen as the expression of hate or as an end in itself, but as a means to restore the world, as a means to counter the institutional and brutal violence that already exists. And so that's one thing. The other thing is the following, that is not only love. I talked about love and rage. And rage gives more direct expression to not only the yes of loving, the affirmation of human reality, but the no, the denunciation, the opposition to the forms of dehumanization that already exist. So you can engage in war, in violence, could be the expression of love. Like, for example, think about you giving something to someone who, you should not be talking to. That would be a disruption, a violence to the order in which they stand themselves. Think about, um, in a segregating concepts, crossing one subject, crossing a frontier for any reason, that is perceived as violence. Uh, but then think about, and that is a form of violence that you are doing in a loving way. Let's say that you are actually approaching someone even in a peaceful means. It will clearly be, people will have a problem to see the connection with love, although it is also connected with rage. But from rage, you see that rage calls for systematic opposition, and that can take place in multiple forms, including politics or including military struggle. So you can have military struggle through love and rage. That's very different from the commitment with annihilation and permanent war that is embedded in modernity coloniality. I hope that was more or less clear. For any reason, that is perceived as violence. But then think about, and that is a form of violence that you are doing in a loving way. Let's say that you are actually approaching someone even in a peaceful means. People will have a problem to see the connection with love.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. It was impressive for me. And I have a question about the capacity of giving. You spoke about the capacity of giving. And I'm curious to understand what is this capacity of the giving you were speaking about. Modern coloniality as the catastrophe of modern world takes away the capacity of giving. Could you please explain that? Thank you. That's my question.
Yeah. Well, what I was trying to say is that and trying to understand human subjectivity, even the emergence of consciousness itself as link to relations of giving and receiving with others. So the human body, is first and foremost this point of contact with others through which we can give and receive. Give ourselves, contact, recognize others, enact connection with others. So that would be a basic modality of the body and of consciousness for giving, for the logic of the gift, embedded in the logic of the gift. What modernity coloniality does is that it changes our perceptions of the body, along with various other forms of basic elements in our human world: time, space, and so on and so forth. Knowledge, what is knowledge? So it changes the meaning. So it leads to a bifurcation of reality that leads some subjects understanding, experiencing their bodies as a curse, as a form of damnation, and therefore as something that they need to escape from or they need to deny. So when you are engaged in self-denial, then your prime project is to deny yourself. It's not to, it's not to enter in uninhibited contact with others. It's to try to enter in contact with a limited set of others deemed racially superior, for example, or superior in whatever form in a context. And you're trying to deny yourself. So the body, instead of becoming the bridge, the connector between you and others, it becomes a target of annihilation, even from yourself. And so that I'm referring to that shift as a form of catastrophe. It's a major turning point, downturn in the creation of a human world. And so that would be the most basic way, but the catastrophic transformation that inhibits interaction, interrelationality. For example, it poses some communities and some bodies like irremediably in the past. Think about how indigeneity is perceived and how indigenous bodies are conceived as peoples and cultures and bodies that they seem to be stuck in traditional formations vis-a-vis modern processes, right? They are linked in so-called tribalism. They are linked in the past. They cannot completely live into the sphere of modernity, a sphere where time goes faster and so on and so forth. But this is an ideology. What I'm saying is that this what modernity does by creating this bifurcation. That's a colonizing bifurcation, which is leading for indigenous people to then, when they face modernity, experience themselves as a problem that needs to be annihilated in order to enter the temporality of the modern, for example. Whereas in this view, no, the temporality of the modern is a skewed temporality that is built on dehumanization, is built on a denial of temporality of the time that emerges in the interrelationship between subjects. And that's the time when subjects begin to interrelate. Then, for example, as someone points out, even the culture becomes dynamic. There are changes in the culture and so on and so forth. So the culture and people become, begin to sort of breathe temporality against colonization. So there are multiple ways in which you can identify the paralysis of time, also the way in which a space is segregated. Think about, Donald Trump. They're about to begin a war, right? So those physical wars between nations are perhaps some of the most graphic material instantiation examples of these walls that modernity has created that that inhibit, not only inhibit contact, but that target subjects against each other and subjects against themselves by virtue of self-denial. Was that clear? Was that helped in any case?
Yes. Yes, already. Do you have a question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
More or less, you can try, but I'm not sure.
I have a general question. Hello. If I understood you correctly, you described two kinds of attitudes, the colonial attitude and decolonial attitude. To put it roughly, the colonial attitude means that we relate to our body as a weapon, and the decolonial attitude means that we relate to our body as gift that gives. And my general question is, under what conditions the change from one attitude, colonial, to decolonial is possible? How do you think, on a theoretical and a practical level, the possibility of change from one attitude to another?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
That's exactly, I mean, for me, the main goal of black skin, white mass, of a non-black skin, white mass. As I was saying, I am one of the readings that I make of the text is as a text that is searching for an attitude, or searching for the decolonial attitude. The first thing that it does is identifies the dominant attitude that exists, and it's an attitude, it's a quote negrophobic. Negrophobic is anti-black attitude that is part of modernity coloniality. So Fanon is looking for a human attitude, for a human affirming attitude, and he finds instead anti-black attitudes in the modern world. Right? That is what he's doing in the initial, 3 chapters particularly. And the 4th chapter similarly, and then the 5th chapter, he begins to say, well, then now let's see how a subject begins to, what happens when a subject is not conformed by following that modern colonial attitude. Right? Let's see the moment when the subject stands up to it. He does it in a graphic way, right? A subject who is seen as a black is called black by a kid. Look, a Negro mama, right? That's how he phrased it in the chapter 5. And then we find that that enacts a drama, a movement in the situation that leads to the subject first smiling, slightly trying to diffuse the situation, until then saying, kiss these Negroes as madame. Right? Saying that, okay, then I am opposing it. I am not going to tolerate it. I am going to see how I counter this. And so that's a moment where you can see that, when that happens, it's like when that subject is brought to the limit, to the edge. So there are moments when that logic is particularly excessive, and the excess of coloniality can sort of generate the resistance, the more explicit resistance. Of course, there are many ways in which subjects can sort of undermine or not follow coloniality and not launch a campaign against it. But particularly when coloniality is excessive and cannot justify itself, that is because sometimes it can be excessive, but then somehow being able to convince everybody that what it's doing is good and justified. But when there is a moment when the excess is combined with with lack of justification, then it opens the door for more radical forms of questioning. Historically speaking, that is what happened in the context of Europe in the first half of the 20th century, when particularly when Europeans were criticizing, vehemently opposing fascism while still defending colonialism. When the Europeans were outraged, or at least some Europeans, about anti-Semitism, but they were completely fine with anti-Arab prejudice, anti-Muslim prejudice, and anti-Black prejudice. Right? And at that moment, I think the hypocrisy of Europe was, and at a moment when the colonial territories were challenging Europeans, and the subjects were seeing that they clearly Europeans were not seeing them as human. It was so clear because they were in the process of elaborating these human rights and so on, and their constitutions talk about we the people and the human, and somehow self-governance did not apply to these people in the colonies. So that kind of massive disgust, hypocrisy can lead to opposition. And Messer in discourse on colonialism points to that moment where he says all over the world colonial subjects now are emerging as judges of Europe. Right? Now the lie of European civilization is becoming revealed, is becoming more explicit. And with it being challenged, with its justification challenged, then it leads to more questioning. So that is what I'm saying is that the excess of the practices of modernity coloniality can begin to start to generate opposition, like in the episode of Black Skin White Mask, when the kid's going, look, Mama Negro, look, Mama Negro, look, Mama Negro, and the mother is complicit with the kid, right? Until it leaves the subject like, either you continue trying to diffuse it, accept it, assimilate, integrate it, or you make a line and say, okay, here it stops. But also historically, it happens historically. There are moments, epochs, moments of time where either the position, the violence is excessive, or what is happening is not justified anymore. It's not recognized as legitimate, and that opens points of critique. So those are two examples where a shift can happen between a subject being in compliance with a modern colonial attitude, and beginning to develop a sort of another kind of attitude. Having said that, it's not even as easy as that. When Fanon talks about that subject that now says, kiss this, ask Madame, now I'm not going to tolerate it, now I'm going to speak back and so on. That subject goes through various layers, moments. And at the end of the chapter, the subject has not, barely reaches the moment of what I think is the decolonial attitude in Fanon. And in the subject, when the subject realizes how far he was from that attitude all along, he starts to weep. So I say weeping, right? Weeping as a crying, weeping as a necessary moment in the production of the decolonial attitude, because you realize how complicit you have been with coloniality, even when you thought that you were being it. And we can go on and on. I mean, as I was saying, that the book is a treatise. I think that the colonial attitude has to do with, it appears thoroughly at the end with the desire to not look for assimilation, not look for recognition from the white or the European, but try to connect with other colonized subjects to build the world of the you. And so, but getting to that attitude is, can happen something very ordinarily and easily, like in intimate moments of love, when you can suddenly enter in that uninhibited form of interaction. But then usually modern coloniality, the modern colonial attitude comes back and defines the relationship, and you begin to, to see yourself in another light. But this modern colonial attitude is prevalent, it has become normal, but that doesn't mean that it has encapsulated all the aspects of our reality. So in our reality, we're all the time defining it in one way or another also. Something's more explicit, something's less explicit. All of this, both the replication of that attitude and the undermining the modern colonial attitude with the appearance of the decolonial attitude in multiple forms, is part of these damnation studies that I am thinking about, right? Look at how the decolonial attitude is seen and how it is explained or approached through, literature, what we call literature, visual art, right? In activism, in social movements, in theory, in empirical studies. We can look for it at all of these dimensions and ways. So again, hopefully that helped address it a little bit.
Okay. We have a question from the social scientist in the University of East Anglia. They ask, what will be the first step to operationalize damnation studies in the context of social science? How does a social science, typically doing empirical research with people, communities, adopt the right attitude in his research for methods without risking to fall back into some sort of glorification of the method?
Yeah. Yeah, another great question. I don't think that here we can be too prescriptive, right? Prescriptive. We can talk about some general guidelines, and I will provide some, but context is very important, right? In what country, in what university, what is, how do you do it? So I can offer some general thoughts, but it's not meant as a recipe, and I can talk about, for example, this happens, how this, let's say, challenge to modern colonial social sciences happen within what is called U.S. ethnic studies, for example, right? So we could look at examples how has been done in different places. We can come up with some general guidelines, but the more precise engagement, the more precise ways of doing it will have to involve knowledge of the specific of the place, and also action. I mean, organizing that place. Okay. So having said that, I think, I mean, the how to, I mean, the question is also, maybe could be rephrased a little bit. How can we decolonize the social sciences? How to decolonize the social sciences? And one of them would be precisely this critical interrogation of the primacy of method, which Fanon's work, Fanon coming trained in psychiatry, but also in psychology as a human, as a social science, is key. I mean, his text is key to help us do that, to interrogate methods, but also to interrogate even the primacy of basic concepts like science and also society. Because, the social sciences sort of tend to posit society as the basic or the base of the unit of analysis. But to what extent, society is also a construction, it's a particular kind of unit. And in these sciences tended to distinguish between also societies and, let's say, tribes, right? And other kinds of forms of communities that didn't measure up to what it was considered to be society proper, which was linked with civil society in the modern nation state. So when we have to interrogate method, when we have to interrogate, again, the notion of science and what knowledge is, one has to interrogate the notion of society. The notion of society has been another source, for example, could be Immanuel Wallerstein, word system analysis, where he writes about what he calls sociology, and he has an essay entitled Sociology and Other Dubious Disciplines. And it's about the ways in which the social science, they take for granted the very notion of society, and that leads you to a kind of analysis that misrepresents and misdiagnoses the problems that we find in modernity. And so he proposes that we look instead not society, but the world system as a unit of analysis and framework, looking at how different regions work and so on and so forth. So there you find another example of an effort to challenge that primacy of society. Another way to do it is by finding ways of breaking the difference between subject and object, right? The social scientists will typically take a particular community or set of group of people as object of analysis. But when you critically engage the subject-object division, then, and particularly through a decolonial attitude, you begin to see other subjects not as objects, but as interlocutors or potential interlocutors and potential allies in the struggle against decoloniality. So the primary element will be not simply, that is an investigation about our reality with people. We have to recognize them not simply as objects, but as interlocutors, more fundamentally as interlocutors. And when you do that, then you begin to engage with them in an enterprise of co-creation of thinking and ideas, and not only simply as of observation of those groups and those peoples. And that's particularly relevant when you are doing analysis of decolonial social movements. There is a long tradition of looking at these movements. For example, a place like Brazil, many experts of ethnic subjects and racial subjects and social movements, but they take them purely as objects and rarely see them as groups of people who are developing concepts and ideas as they are trying to diagnose power and as they are trying to navigate the structure of modernity coloniality. So those kind of so-called damnation studies will have to, or damnation activity or decolonial thinking may be better, will have to be about engaging in different forms of uh, reflection that bring in groups that we would have taken as objects also as interlocutors as well. These are some general indications. Of course, we always have to be mindful about how methods, how we use method and avoid, as the question had it, the questions come and reintroduce themselves as primary. And that is a constant exercise of using method, but also suspending the ultimacy of methods. Lewis Gordon writes about that in his approach to decadence in the European human sciences. So that's something else that we always have to be vigilant about that, and also break the divisions between the arts and the human sciences. So one can see also the way in which writers and artists and so on are building concepts that are important for looking at the world and understanding the world. So it's not simply these concepts are not going to come only from empirical observation.
Thank you.
These are some general indications. Of course, we always have to be mindful about how methods, how we use method, and avoid, as the question had it, the questions come and reintroduce themselves as primary, and there is a constant exercise.
Hello. So I would have two questions, maybe very quick. The first one, you said that the concept of violence can be understood inside the institution. So the institutions is responsible, or the way the society is organized is responsible to reproduce this violence. And then you said that violence can be understood as well as the eruption of this order that is reproducing violence. And so the first question would be, do you think that we need another concept, a different one, to account for this ambiguity? Violence in a first sense, so violence that is being reproduced, and violence in a second sense as the eruption of the other. Because when we put everything inside the same concept, it can turn against us. We can always use it to criticize the approach and so on. I say that because there is a researcher in Brazil that tries to use the concept of violence today, and he's very, very heavily criticized for that. And so this is the first point. And the second one is related to the institutions. So if the institution is responsible for reproducing the same state of affairs, and if we need another attitude, and one of these institutes is the university, so how do you see the relation of academia today as an institution and the possibility of a new decolonial attitude? Is it possible inside the university? Do we have to go outside the university? Is the university blocking this new attitude? So how do you see the relation between university as an institution and the decolonial attitude? Thank you.
Thanks. With regards to violence, I think, yes, we may be able to use multiplicity of concepts to make the distinction. You realize that, in my presentation, I don't think I used the concept of violence to begin with. And I clearly was talking about, different forms of subversion, insurrection, opposition and so on, but I was not using violence. I talk about permanent war, and I talk about insurrection. So I think already in what I was saying, I was using concepts that could be used to go around the sometimes polarizing discussion that can emerge with violence. Right? With regards to the violence, as a matter of fact, when I talk about the things, the theme of violence comes not so much because I have mentioned it, but because people are most familiar with chapter 1 of Breaches of the Earth, and as soon as Fanon is mentioned, then the theme of Fanon as an apostle of violence comes to everybody's minds. So then when you mention love, it makes you wonder what the hell, how does that square with the picture of Fanon as the apostle of violence? But what I'm saying is that it's not that the set of concepts that I have deployed immediately, I think depending on that opposition, I think I'm offering already another ways of understanding it. That's one. Two, at the same time, I want to say, we may need, we need others, and we can navigate the question another way and put other names, but also not before also maybe challenging or stopping to question why are we so sometimes disturbed by violence, right? As if people who have been enslaved, dehumanized, and so on and so forth do not have the right, or whether it is negative that they would respond to that system of brutal system with acts that we would consider violent, even in an extreme way. Right? What if, because sometimes if we begin to, and this will be my worry with sanitizing it sometimes, right? I think there's something good to do that, but I also would not do it without first going through this process, because it should not be because we do not want to recognize the right, if you will, of, or not the right, the how violent response is something completely within the parameters of the world, and even sometimes completely justified. For when you see, for example, the riots, a so-called riot, right, a riot, then if we begin to tiptoe around violence and so on, and thinking that anything like explicit violence is like inherently problematic, we see a riot and we say that immediately we want to condemn it, and immediately we want to say, no, those people who were opposing, who were behaving in that, they were not doing properly, they should have done it in this other way, and this other, saying, really, we're going to about to celebrate the 25th year of the Rodney King case and the beating in 1992. There are a number of documentaries that will come out exploring that this year. So after the police came out as innocent, there was massive riots in the streets and so on and so forth. And so I think that to some extent we need to say, well, how not? The question is, why didn't happen earlier, for example? And so while I want to get more conceptual precision, at the same time, I will not do it for the sake of somehow, sort of sanitizing the actions of colonized peoples, or as if, by implication, saying that the good colonized subjects are those that respond in a way that we cannot classify as violent. But if we use violent, then they're not as good. I would say that it's not bad that there is some level of discomfort when we use violence with what they do. And so until we can reconcile ourselves with that kind of action, we may not be able to fully accept or engage in the decolonial projects. So I want to pose that interrogation also before jumping too quickly, I think, into finding another kind of talk. And that not meaning any glorification of any kind of particular action. Right? So the question about the institution, yes, I mean, terribly, the university, the Western University, as a grounded on a modern colonial attitude, and organized in light of that attitude, is fully militating aggressively against the formation of anything like the decolonial attitudes, right? Aggressively militating. That is why, for example, what I called before ethnic studies that was formed out of this attitude, I believe, and these movements in the late 60s and early 70s have had an extremely rocky, very difficult existence in the academy, even as they have influenced, greatly many fields, including particularly in literature, English, in the social sciences, and so on, that suddenly begin to take cognizance of people of color, not necessarily as problems, but as people, as Luis Gordon says, as people who face problems. Um, so it has an impact, but they remain in a very difficult and intractable situation, typically seen as I was saying, less rigorous, as only providing service to communities of color, but not actually substantial thinking, as ethnic studies in the academy being seen as uh, temporary measures that soon enough will be the task of ethnic studies will be absorbed by the traditional disciplines, and then we will have better knowledge because it's method-driven knowledge by the traditional sciences, and we can then do away with ethnic studies and so on and so forth, right? We can see the differential funding that these units receive. Some units receive, even in the humanities, right? There is a difference, for example, between a humanities program being seen as unproductive in this neoliberal culture, and that means less funding, that means you're going to have trouble, and so on. But with ethnic studies in the US, it's clear that it's not so, the problem is not that it is unproductive, like language or literature is. The problem is that it is threatening. That's something else. That's why here in the U.S. in Arizona, the state has militated against, as against what Chicano, Latino, raza studies, as some ethnic studies, and the arguments have been that it is instilling people to hate the U.S., right? To not recognize national history, to be skeptical about national history. Supposedly, it's being accused. Ethnic studies has been accused of advancing the reconquest of the U.S. by Mexicans, right? So what it generates in the population at large, not only in the academy, is this kind of hysteria because it is threatened. So it's extremely difficult to do it in the academy, extremely difficult, because the academy has been sort of mission with the goal of vetting what is accepted knowledge, justified knowledge, and what not. And there is much investment into making sure that certain forms of insurrection do not appear as knowledge, completely as knowledge, do not aspire, meaning that it's not knowledge that would, let's say, affect the way that we design public schools or hospitals or other institutions, right? So the university is, in a way, worse than a prison in that respect, right? It's a place where these knowledges and these efforts are being targeted and shut down in multiple ways, from microaggressions, so-called microaggressions in the job market, in the workplace, for people of color, and particularly for people of color who engage in decolonial projects, and for the institutional spaces that have been advanced in this kind of work. So it is extremely difficult. Um, Nonetheless, I think it is necessary. And but that doesn't mean that the academy is the only place where we need to develop this kind of knowledge. It's just one space among others, but it's a dominant one. And we only leave it without fighting at that to our peril, because we cannot make it easier and uncontested for the European sciences and these disciplines and these methods to continue as if they are the only ones in town. They are the only ones accepted. So as difficult as it is, I think that we need the task of constant critique. Aníbal Quijano writes of being within and against at the same time, right? While also we create alliances and we create new institutions alliances with other groups outside of the university, alliances with other people in the university, beyond the social sciences, the humanities, beyond the professional schools, beyond these distinctions. Lina mentioned in the introduction that I presided the Caribbean Philosophical Association. That is one effort of an institutional, project, an institutional building of trying to open up a space for new kind of interventions in philosophy that it is extremely difficult to do in the American Philosophical Association, for example, or other professional organizations, or in departments of philosophy, right? So I do philosophy, and I'm not in the Department of Philosophy in my university, where philosophy is very analytic, for example, right? Um, so you do it from the sideline, something from the margin, sometimes even out of, but you don't give away, you don't give, and I haven't given up the idea of producing what they call philosophy, and even claiming it's like that, even what I am doing from another place. Because as there are people breathing and thinking, they will see that there are other options. So it's important to make sure that there is a record of those options, that those options exist, so that more and more people, when they enter the academy, they don't have to think that the only solution is assimilation into these models. So as difficult as it is, it's pretty difficult. I mean, doing this kind of work in any other institution, it's not like it is easier in other institutions. And it's not that it is easy, even culturally speaking, even in our day-to-day lives. I mean, it's a challenge because you are going against the trend of a settled form of thinking, being, and doing. So everywhere where you challenge coloniality and you enact the colonial attitude, you are going to face a number of troubles and problems, and you're going to face the policing, forces that police you and try to put you into place. The equivalent of, look and Negro mama, that's what you find all the time. Now, that can be extremely difficult, but it's not the only difficult place, and it is also not the only necessary place where we need to intervene. But we need to do it creatively, escaping the, resigning from the system of legitimization that already exists in the academy. We don't have to comply with that system of meritocracy. We can be there, fulfilled to some extent, that, so that we continue working on it, but our criteria of excellence be derived from somewhere else and be higher than the one that we find there. And we can occupy that place, but multiple spaces at the same time. So that's what I would say. So everywhere you challenge coloniality and you enact the colonial attitude, you are going to face
one question. I maybe will ask you one question. So at the end of your presentation, you talked about something that we call me like a politics of rewriting history, and you said that we should focus our attention in major moments of metaphysical catastrophe. And you talked about how we shouldn't do, or decolonial thinking shouldn't focus on, not on the turns in the history of a species, but on the turns of what you call metaphysical catastrophe. And you pointed that the conquest of America was one of these like fatal turning points. And that made me think on that maybe one of the most important characteristics of colonization is the divide nature culture. So, and it's maybe one of the most profound metaphysical catastrophes, in the sense that it created divide between what Arturo Escobar calls relational ontologies, which are ontologies related with nature that perceive humanity as being in continuous relationship with Earth and with other beings, non-humans. And also, and then, so there's on this one, on one side, these ontological, on relational ontologies, which are related with nature, and then coloniality will produce this divide between nature, culture, humans, and non-humans. So I was wondering how, because in the idea of damnation and in this idea of humanity based on the capacity of giving, of the gift, it seems to me that it opens up the possibility of doing a history, or rewriting a history of humanity that departs from this divide nature culture, and that will be like very but from a human perspective, which is completely different from certain approaches, post-humanist approaches that we can find, for example, in these theories of the actor network theory, which for me, like, they have like a lot of problems, because it's like you don't have any perspective, and then it's like you create a third eye, which is like not a human eye. So it reproduces this idea of colonialism, I think so. So I don't know if you have, if you will agree that this idea of a new humanity based on the idea of gift will provide a way to rewrite history, not like a post-humanist history, but a new history of humanity where we are not seen as detached from nature, or yeah. So, and how can that help to environmental studies? Yeah.
Yeah. No, thanks. Yes, I was being partly intentionally provocative how I phrased the opposition to the notion of the study of the human species or the entire history, in part to provoke some kind of question like that, but more really to sort of challenge the approach that exists in a lot of the literature, philosophical literature, for example, about trying to understand, do philosophical anthropology by focusing on these imaginary conceptions of the human being, and you think about the state of nature, or coming from the anthropology, archaeology, and so on, of trying to identify the earliest moments of human beings and when they were. Right? So those are the two specific targets with this idea, because usually they posit themselves as